You go to hell! You go to hell and you die!
What's up guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Louisa, and if you're new here, welcome. Don't forget to subscribe and check out all of the stuff that I've previously made, because there are some interesting things to talk about. So for those of you who are new, just a quick recap. I used to have a witchcraft channel, and I would regularly get comments from different Christians, and it seemed like kind of a cut and paste sort of thing that they would do, and there would be lots and lots of Bible verses in it, and some of the comments were, you know, concerned. Fair enough. But some of the comments were just straight up saying, you're evil, you're going to hell. Very much along the lines of Mr. Garrison from South Park. And for people who are in the pagan New Age community, they either think that you are misguided or they think that you're stupid. They generally believe that they have enlightenment and that you are stuck in the Stone Age. And so mostly it just falls on deaf ears. So I wanted to do a video giving a little bit of advice to Christians out there who are trying to do outreach to witches and to the pagan community and people who might be involved in things like mediumship. Because you know what the Bible says and you know that it's true, but they think that you're delusional. So throwing Bible verses at them is going to have zero impact. So I wanted to talk about things that actually might have an impact or might get them to think a little bit. And I also wanted to talk to you about why people get into witchcraft in the first place, so that you can have some idea of what you're dealing with and who you're communicating with. So a lot of you will already be familiar with what the Bible does say about communicating with spirits that are not from God. But for those of you who aren't aware, we're going to recap a little bit. Leviticus chapter 19 verse 31 says, "Give no regard to mediums and familiar spirits, do not seek after them, to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God." In Deuteronomy chapter 18 it says, "There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire, one who uses divination, one who practices witchcraft, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who casts spells, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. For whoever does these things is detestable to the Lord, and because of these detestable things the Lord your God will drive them out before you." Isaiah chapter 8 says, "When they say to you, consult the mediums and the spiritists who whisper and mutter, should not a people consult their God? Should they consult the dead on behalf of the living? To the law and to the testimony. If they do not speak according to this word, it is because they have no dawn." And 1 Chronicles chapter 10 says, "So Saul died for his trespass which he committed against the Lord, because of the word of the Lord which he did not keep, and also because he asked counsel of a medium, making inquiry of it." So there's actually heaps more in the Bible about what happens if you do consult spirits and what the punishment for that is. Usually it's death, or at the very least it's eternal damnation in a lake of fire. So the first thing you have to understand when you're talking to people who are dabbling in witchcraft and things like that is the complete lack of information that they have about what they're doing. I mean, for me, it took years of research and actually examining what it was that I was being taught. And I have to say, one of the biggest influences on people in this day and age is how acceptable and common it is in media. You look at movies like The Craft or Practical Magic, and they really make it just almost normalized. When you start getting into shows like the new Sabrina series, they're not even pretending anymore what it's supposed to be. They are actually acknowledging that they sell their soul to demons. And it's this thing of kind of displaying it in plain sight, which makes people doubt that it's real, because they sensationalize it, they turn it into like a fantasy adventure, and it has no grounding in reality for them. Like, it really just turns into an aesthetic. And if you go on different social media platforms like Instagram or Pinterest, it is all about the aesthetic. There is absolutely no critical analysis of exactly how this works, what the mechanics are, where the stuff comes from. But there's also a lot of misinformation about where the stuff comes from as well, and I'll get into that. So the first thing is normalization in the culture and in media. Number two is that people don't really know what is in the Bible, and even if they do know, they don't think that it has any basis in reality. So one of the reasons why people don't believe that the Bible has any basis in reality is a mixture of things. There's the cultural shift, there's the influences of different schools of philosophy to do with atheism, nihilism, existentialism, modern and postmodern thought. And modern and postmodern thought are all about deconstruction. And the thing about deconstruction is they pull everything apart in order to see what's there. But in the process of actually deconstructing, they remove what's there. And then they get to nothing, and they're like, well, nothing was there the entire time. And it's like, no, you dismantled what was there and then just threw it away like it was meaningless. So deconstructing the entire framework of God basically means that you have no guidelines left. And so most modern schools of thought assume that there are no guidelines, and then they just make things up for themselves. And that's exactly what you're dealing with when you deal with the occult. They don't have guidelines, they don't have boundaries, they don't have rules. They don't even necessarily believe that there are consequences to their actions. So it's pretty hard to have a conversation with someone about consequences and natural law if they don't believe that it exists. So it's kind of like their concept of enlightenment is that they understand that nothing is real, there is no right or wrong, it's just energy. They're always told about different energetic forces, but they're not really told about an actual spiritual warfare. It's more like this very dry, pseudo-scientific version, kind of based very loosely on quantum physics. It's very much a spiritist interpretation of quantum physics. So in some ways bits and pieces apply, but the problem is that they're not attributing these forces to any kind of source. They're just saying that these forces exist and just kind of hang around waiting for people to command them. So you might be wondering, why would someone who doesn't really have much of a belief system, why would they even be interested in spiritual activity in the first place? Because you might assume that it's just going to go the way of like atheism, where they put a lot of stock in science, but kind of ignore the areas where science just doesn't have an explanation, or where science kind of falls down without a particular explanation for it. So why even pursue something like witchcraft in the first place? Well, for a lot of people who do delve into witchcraft, it's because they have supernatural experiences that they can't explain. So they encounter the paranormal, whether they like it or not. And because the devil is actually quite sophisticated, he doesn't necessarily appear as what most people would assume a demonic form will appear as. So people get these visitations. Sometimes they're in the form of like a shadow, sometimes they're in the form of an alien, sometimes they're not even scary. Some kids especially will have like the invisible friend, or they might present themselves as a ghost of someone who has departed, or they might particularly target someone in the form of a family member. And the thing is, like, these people haven't necessarily done anything wrong, or they haven't intended to make contact. Visitations can start as early as birth. So I knew a couple who, as soon as they brought their baby daughter home, started getting infested. They were smudging their house with sage. They were doing all of the correct New Age things in order to try and get this entity out. But it had come for their baby, and it had a doorway into their house because their relationship was really discordant and they were fighting a lot. And like, this haunting wasn't even like subtle, like it was quite obvious. They would watch objects in their house move. I walked into their house and I was like, what is going on here? Because you've got something in your home. And they were like, oh, no, we've smudged, everything's fine. And I'm like, you have a fish tank full of dead fish in your house. There is an oppressive energy in here, like, it is nasty. So, you know, the ways that these things get into people's lives is like so easy. It's incredible. And then getting them out again, that's the tough job, because you cannot do it under your own steam. You have to call on God and Jesus for help. So I've mentioned before that at one point I had a haunted house, and I think it was haunted before we bought it, but it didn't really manifest straight away. But it was pretty obvious when it did start manifesting. It did things like turn electronics on and off. It made noises. It was appearing to more than one person in the house. So at the time I worked in a public library, and what I decided to do was do my own research. So I actually started out with the Christian books, believe it or not. I went into all of the paranormal books written from a Christian perspective, because I had been raised to believe that there was power in the name of Jesus, but I didn't really know if the church actually put that much stock in it, because I had never really seen the church do much in terms of sorting out people's haunted houses or anything like that. It kind of always seemed, through media again, to be the realm of mediums. So most of the resources that the public library had about Christian versions of hauntings and exorcisms and that sort of stuff was centered around people like Ed and Lorraine Warren. And I have to say, like, I have never been able to trust their work entirely, because it seems as though they just sell sensationalized books. I could kind of tell even back then that they weren't really interested in proclaiming that God is more powerful than the devil. And since coming back to Christianity, I would say that I trust their work even less. There is 365 instances in the Bible where it says, "Be not afraid." That is literally one a day for a year. And when it comes to the demonic, they feed on fear. That's their food. They eat it for breakfast. So the more afraid you are, the more afraid that they can make you, the more sustained and emboldened they become. So in my opinion, the Warrens built an entire career on sustaining the demonic, rather than testifying that they are in fact weak and pathetic compared to God. And the thing that a lot of people don't understand is that the demonic really only operates because God has allowed free will. So he has allowed them to have free will, and he has allowed us to have free will. So we can engage with that stuff if we want to. And the Bible has a whole bunch of guidelines for shutting the door on these things, making sure that they don't have an entry point into your lives in the first place, how to shut them out again, and also how to ask for help. But of course, culturally, The devil has done an incredibly good job of convincing people that he doesn't exist, and that all of these things that open us up to encounters and to entangling our souls with demons, all of these things are just seen as fine and no big deal, and that's just life. The ultimate lie is probably neutrality. The idea that there's no good or evil. The idea that you don't have to pick a side. But there is no such thing as neutral ground, because we are the ground. Like, we are the territory that is being fought over. And the thing is, like, with God, you have to choose him. Like, you have to actually choose him, because his way is not easy. It's not the easier option. It really isn't. So if you don't pick it, you pick this. So a perfect example of this in the Bible is Matthew chapter 12, where it talks about the parable of the empty house. When an unclean spirit goes out of a man, he goes through dry places, seeking rest, and finds none. Then he says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when he comes, he finds it empty, swept, and put in order. Then he goes and takes with him 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, and they enter and dwell there. And the last state of that man is worse than the first. So shall it also be for this wicked generation. So that is literally Jesus saying that you cannot just empty out your house and have no indwelling of any sort, because you will get an indwelling and it will not be God. So I think for Christians, if you are engaging with anyone who is in the New Age or who is in witchcraft or paganism or anything like that, something that is really worth talking to them about is, what exactly are they filling their spirit with? And maybe like refer to that particular reading, because it very much says that there is no such thing as an empty neutral space. It will be occupied, but it's up to you what you occupy it with. So I can tell you now what they will probably answer to that question when you say, what are you filling yourself with? Because a lot of them practice meditation, which is all about emptying. It's all about emptying, it's all about channeling. They don't really necessarily associate it with channeling, but it is. So one of the lies that gets taught in the New Age is that there is this neutral energy and it's naturally abundant like sunlight. So all you have to do is channel light. So this is one of the things that they will be taught as part of the New Age, is that they are channeling light. And it kind of falls down a little bit when you delve into people like Helena Blavatsky, who taught that Lucifer was the light bringer and that he is also the Son of God. And it's worth questioning where they think this light source comes from. They'll often say it's the universe, but that is not what the original teachers of the New Age actually taught. So another thing that you could probably question them about is the concept of spirit guides, because the idea of neutral sources of light tends to unravel a little bit when you get into the realm of spirit guides, because then they have to acknowledge that they are engaging with entities. So then you can begin to probe a little bit further and ask them, where do these entities come from? How do you know that you can trust them? When you start getting into this territory, then they will probably start talking about light beings, star seeds, and also angels. And this is where you can start challenging them on that particular aspect, because it will literally say in the Bible that the devil can masquerade as a being of light. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, it says, "For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light. Therefore it is no great thing if his ministers also transform themselves into ministers of righteousness, whose end will be according to their works." So this is a passage you can refer to when you're talking about how the demonic can pretend to be beings of light. They will often pretend to be from Christ, but usually the thing that defines them as being evil instead of good is, of course, the fruits of what they produce. So the next phase that you need to engage with is asking how they actually discern the truth and validity of the spirits. And one of the really common themes with people who are contacted by different entities such as aliens or light beings or supposedly angels is that these entities will really puff them up. They will promise the world, they will tell these people that they're very special, that they are chosen, that they are powerful. And of course, being a Christian, you would probably understand that this is not what humans are made for. The very first sin, the very original sin, was the sin of hubris, which was imagining that people could be similar to God or similar to even the angels. So in the first letter of John, there are a few passages which talk about how to test the spirits and also how to determine if you're on the right track. In chapter 2 it says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world is passing away, and the lust of it. But he who does the will of God abides forever." So if people encounter spirits and they're very concerned with prosperity and things like that, chances are it's not God. So later on in chapter 4, it says how to test the spirits. "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits, whether they are of God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is of God. And every spirit that does not confess that Jesus has come in the flesh is not of God. And this is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard was coming and now is already in the world." So this is something that people can employ if they are in the New Age, if they are exposed to spiritual contact. They can either rebuke in the name of Jesus or demand that the spirit confess Jesus. And this will do one of two things. It will either confirm that it is a being from God, or it will repel it. So these are all techniques to help get the conversation going with people who might be in the New Age or who might be in witchcraft and who are being told to make all of this contact with all of these different spirits. But really at some point you have to broach the subject of the fact that having anything to do with the dead or with spirits is damnation. So one of the most useful passages to start with is probably the Witch of Endor, which is in 1 Samuel. In chapter 28 it says, "Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had lamented for him and buried him in Ramah in his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and the spiritists out of the land. Then the Philistines gathered together and came and encamped at Shunem. So Saul gathered all Israel together, and they encamped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams, or by Urim, or by the prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, 'Find me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her.'" So that instruction that King Saul gave to his men to find a medium, there's actually different translations of that. And as I mentioned before, there was another passage that I quoted before which talked about familiar spirits. So that particular passage, in the original King James Version, it actually says, "Seek me a woman that hath a familiar spirit." And the distinction is kind of important, and I will get to that in a little while because it relates, as you might imagine, to spirit guides. "And his servant said to him, 'In fact, there is a woman who is medium at Endor.' So Saul disguised himself and put on other clothes, and he went and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. And he said, "Please conduct a seance for me, and bring up for me the one I shall name to you." Then the woman said to him, "Look, you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the spiritists from the land. Why then do you lay a snare for my life to cause me to die?" And Saul swore to her by the Lord, saying, "As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing." Then the woman said, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" And he said, "Bring up Samuel for me." When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out in a loud voice, and the woman spoke to Saul, saying, "Why have you deceived me? For you are Saul." And the king said to her, "Do not be afraid. What do you see?" And the woman said to Saul, "I saw a spirit ascending out of the earth." So he said to her, "What is his form?" And she said, "An old man is coming up, and he is covered with a mantle." And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed down. Now Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" And Saul answered, "I am deeply distressed, for the Philistines make war against me, and God has departed from me and does not answer me any more, neither by prophets nor by dreams. Therefore I have called you, that you may reveal to me what I should do." Then Samuel said, "So why do you ask me, seeing the Lord has departed from you and has become your enemy? And the Lord has done for himself as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord, nor execute his fierce wrath upon Amalek. Therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with you into the hand of the Philistines. And tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also deliver the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines." Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground and was dreadfully afraid because of the words of Samuel, and there was no strength in him, for he had not eaten food all day or all night. So there's a few things going on in that particular story, and I wanted to start with mediumship and familiar spirits. So back in the day when people lived in tribes and clans, they usually had witch doctors. And often the witch doctor came from a particular family. There was a bloodline with a spirit attached to it. Now, the spirit enabled the witch doctor to access certain things like reading omens, divining the future, trying to do different journeyings into the spirit realm. In some cases, they were referred to as like deities or different nature spirits, but in some traditions they were referred to as ancestors. These days we would refer to them as spirit guides, and they enable a medium or a spiritist or a witch to do their work. So one of the things that you can challenge a practitioner on if they are involved in witchcraft is the idea of offerings. Now there's lots and lots of references to sacrifices and offerings in the Old Testament, and a lot of it was done to God. But since the sacrifice of Jesus, it has no longer been necessary for Christians to offer different sacrificial animals and whatnot, things like the scapegoat. But the Bible doesn't just refer to God being given offerings, it also refers to demons being given offerings, things like Moloch. So the Bible specifically says, do not make offerings to different demons, do not pass your children through the fires of Moloch. Basically what they used to do was they would actually throw living children into a furnace and burn them alive. And one of the most disturbing things is the fact that Moloch is still worshipped in the US at a place called Bohemian Grove in California. As far as I can tell, there is no direct evidence that they use real sacrifices, but considering everything that we've seen with like secret hidden islands and things like that, nothing would surprise me. So witchcraft and various different practices have offerings, and it might be something along the lines of like flowers or fruit or what they call libations, which is things like alcohol. They also offer incense and smoke. That is a form of offering. In the Bible it does say that God also accepts offerings of incense. So It's not that everything is an offering to demons, but you really have to be making a very clear distinction as to where those offerings are going. So there's lots of different cultural practices around leaving out sacrifices for demons, and it is quite literally plainly said that these offerings are made for demons, like the festival of the hungry ghosts in Buddhism. Halloween, even Dia de los Muertos is really a sacrifice to the dead. But in the Bible, it expressly forbids necromancy. So this is a reality that many different cultures have understood for thousands of years. They already know that the demonic realm exists, that it is real, that it requires some kind of appeasement. So even in modern day witchcraft, they will engage in feeding different entities, and they will leave things out, like they'll leave out copper coins for fairies and things like that. But some of them who are, I guess, hereditary witches, they will kind of worship the ancestors, and they will give blood offerings of their own blood to their ancestors. And it's like, why do your ancestors require blood? And so there's kind of this teaching in modern day witchcraft where it's like, you can charge a spell with energy by offering your blood. And so once again, it's seen as like this neutral, natural force that you can just lend your personal energy to. But for a lot of people who actually do know where it comes from, what the practice is, it's actually a blood offering, and it is a blood pact. So whether they like to acknowledge it or not, they are essentially creating a contract with demons. So the second thing that I wanted to point out about the Witch of Endor story is that it works. She actually does summon Samuel from the dead. So that's the thing, like, it's kind of naive and disingenuous to say that it's not real, because it is real. However, the spirit of Samuel literally says, like, you're already kind of screwed, and now you've just absolutely nailed your coffin by conjuring me. Once again, it's that thing of trying to have the powers of God for yourself, commanding the dead, trying to divine the future, trying to affect the outcome of the future. And these are not things that are intended for human beings. So the last thing that you need to understand, if you are a Christian who is trying to talk to someone who is in the New Age or in witchcraft, the last reason why people often pursue something like that is because of power. And it's actually more complicated than it sounds. For a lot of Christians, they kind of think that, you know, they have that stereotypical idea of the bitter, scorned, evil woman trying to grab power for herself. And maybe true about 20% of the time. But for the other 80% of people who would get into witchcraft, it's actually because they have been victims of abuse. So for people who have experienced extreme deprivation of basic human rights, it's very, very enticing to try and protect themselves in some way. It's almost like a form of OCD. It's trying to have all of this control over a situation that you don't have any control over. And so you'll often find people in witchcraft who have extreme anxiety. And they had the anxiety before they went into witchcraft, but the thing is, like, it doesn't help. If you think of the mental health ramifications of trying to be very controlling, trying to be very superstitious, and compulsively do things to, like, ease your anxiety, it just kind of makes it worse. It reinforces it. And the other thing is, like, if you are the one who is ultimately responsible for all of your fortunate outcomes as well as all of your unfortunate outcomes, that is a lot of pressure. Christians tend to be way more chill about stuff simply because they know that they have the ability to give it to God, and that it kind of doesn't matter what the outcome is, because ultimately God prevails and they will either be okay or they will be taken to heaven. But one of the things that Christians really need to understand about people who are really, really anxious and really, really trying to exercise control in their lives is they see Christianity as one of those power structures. They see it as this bullying, controlling authority figure. And in some situations, they have actually experienced the abuse that they went through Christians or through religious organizations. And so that's a big issue. But just in general, they hate authority figures because they will be associated with someone who has power and who abuses it. So often these people hate the church, and often they also hate God. And it's because their example of authority figures has been incredibly toxic. In many ways, when it comes to Christianity, they often, and I mean, this is actually biblical, God represents the father figure and the church represents the mother figure. And in Christian doctrine, it's supposed to be a benevolent, loving, parenting kind of relationship. So the father that protects and provides, and the mother that nurtures and shelters. If you think of it in psychological terms, it's kind of like Baumann's theory of attachment. So depending on the parenting style that the person experienced growing up, they may have experienced either very neglectful parents who really didn't care, were very uninvolved, and did not have security and structure in their life, or possibly just didn't even exist in their life. As I said before, they may have had parents who were authoritarian and who basically abused their position of power. Or they may have even had overly permissive parents who did not provide any kind of structure or guidelines for what they should do. And that's very much where the New Age kind of goes with parenting. And so in psychological terms, children who experience any of those three types of parenting will be pretty damaged psychologically. There is only one type of parenting that actually gives children a firm foundation from which to develop. And that's a style of parenting known as authoritative. So it's not authoritarian, where there's a lack of care and they just abuse their power. There is rules and guidelines, and there are firm boundaries, but within those boundaries is a lot of love and care. And that is how God actually is, and that is how the church is supposed to be, and that is how parents are supposed to be, which is why the Bible is so very, very interested in marriage and parenting, because early childhood development is kind of the foundation and the platform from which children get to understand who God is and where they can find safety. And if that is undermined by abuse early on, then that relationship is going to be broken. So my last piece of advice to Christians, if you are dealing with someone who is dabbling in witchcraft or who has gone into the New Age, is to pray. Pray that they get the emotional healing that they need from that very, very intense initial wound. Because that is one of the biggest things that will separate them from God. And it's also one of the reasons why they become so vulnerable to supernatural encounters and paranormal attacks. it's actually one of the doorways. It's one of the doorways that the demonic gets into people's lives. And it sucks because it's not their fault. So it's not their fault, but they now have the task of having to close that door. And they have that task of trying to build and understand that relationship with God. So hopefully that was helpful. It does suck that this is so common, and I think it really has a lot to say about modern parenting. But part of the task of Christians is to try and restore some of that faith in authority. And that is not an easy task. Like, that is a lot to overcome. So keep praying. I will keep praying, and God bless. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe and share this with anyone who needs to know this. And yeah, I will see you next time. Bye.